Her real man, coworker, mocked me at dinner. Security ended up carrying him out on a stretcher. I never expected a routine company dinner would end with paramedics and police cars, but that's exactly what happened when Rebecca's coworker decided to test whether I was man enough for his standards. I'm a data analyst, 32 years old, married to Rebecca for 6 years, and I've spent most of my adult life preferring spreadsheets to confrontation. Rebecca works in marketing for a mid-sized tech firm in downtown Portland, and every quarter they host these elaborate dinners at expensive restaurants to celebrate hitting their targets. Usually I skip them because watching people get drunk and talk about conversion rates isn't my idea of entertainment, but Rebecca had specifically asked me to come to this one. Please, she'd said that morning while getting ready for work. Margaret's bringing her husband, and I don't want to be the only spouse who couldn't convince their partner to show up. I should have asked why that mattered so much to her, but I just agreed because making Rebecca happy has always been my default setting. The restaurant was one of those places where the menu doesn't list prices and the waiters describe each dish like they're narrating a nature documentary. We arrived at 7, and Rebecca immediately tensed up when she saw the seating arrangement. Her entire marketing division was clustered at 3 large tables near the back, and right in the center of the chaos was Garrett. I'd heard his name exactly twice before. Once when Rebecca mentioned a new guy had joined her team, and once when she'd come home frustrated about someone talking over her in a presentation. Garrett was loud, that's the first thing I noticed. His voice carried across the entire section like he had a personal PA system, booming about his weekend hunting trip where he'd apparently shot a 8-point buck at 300 yards. Clean kill, right through the heart, he announced to nobody in particular, making a shooting gesture with his hands. That's what happens when you actually know how to handle yourself in the real world. The other marketing people laughed in that uncomfortable way people do when someone's trying too hard to impress them. Rebecca guided us to our assigned seats, which turned out to be directly across from Garrett and his date, a woman who looked absolutely miserable and kept checking her phone like she was timing how long she had to endure this. Rebecca, Garrett said, his eyes sliding over to me with obvious assessment. This must be the famous husband. Data analyst, right? Rebecca mentioned you work with numbers all day. I extended my hand. That's right. Nice to meet you. His handshake was one of those aggressive squeezing contests some guys feel compelled to initiate, like crushing someone's fingers proves something profound about character. I didn't squeeze back, just maintained normal pressure until he let go, looking vaguely disappointed. Data analyst, he repeated like he was testing how the words tasted. So you basically sit at a computer all day crunching numbers for other people to use. Must be exciting. The way he said, exciting, made it clear he thought it was anything but. It pays well and I'm good at it, I said simply, picking up my menu. That's what matters. Rebecca jumped in quickly. He's being modest. His analysis saved his company almost $2 million last year by identifying inefficiencies in their supply chain. Garrett waved his hand dismissively. Sure. Number stuff. Important, I guess, for people who are into that. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. Garrett was a big guy, maybe 6'2", probably 220, with the kind of build that comes from serious gym time. He wore it like armor, constantly adjusting his position to make his shoulders look broader. Me, I prefer work where you can actually see the results. Marketing's about psychology, about reading people, knowing what makes them tick. It's a blood sport, really. You've got to have killer instincts. His date still hadn't looked up from her phone. The appetizers arrived and Garrett ordered a second bourbon, his first already gone. The conversation drifted to work talk, campaigns and metrics and client relationships, and I zoned out like I usually do at these things. Then Garrett pivoted. So Rebecca tells us you've never been hunting, he said, cutting into the relative piece. Never shot a gun, never been fishing, nothing like that. I glanced at Rebecca, who was suddenly very interested in her salad. Not really my thing, I said. I'm more of a book and movie person. Garrett laughed, loud enough that people at the neighboring table looked over. Book and movie person. Man, Rebecca, how do you deal with that? Don't you ever want a guy who can actually do something physical? Someone who knows how to handle himself. The table went quiet. Margaret, Rebecca's department head, cleared her throat awkwardly. Two other colleagues, Vanessa and Tom, suddenly found their drinks fascinating. Rebecca's face flushed. Garrett, that's completely inappropriate. What? I'm just saying relationships need balance. You're this ambitious, driven woman, crushing it at work, and you've got a husband who probably can't change a tire. He gestured at me with his fork. No offense, man, but you've got to admit that's a little embarrassing. What happens if someone breaks into your house? You going to calculate the statistical probability of survival? I took a sip of water, keeping my voice level. I'd call the police like any rational person would. The police, Garrett repeated mockingly. Right, because they'll get there in time. Real men protect their families themselves. They don't wait for someone else to handle their problems. His date finally spoke. Garrett, maybe we should talk about something else. He ignored her completely. I'm just concerned for Rebecca, you know? She deserves someone who can actually defend her if things get real. Not someone who hides behind spreadsheets. Margaret stood up. Garrett, I think you've had enough to drink. Maybe you should. I'm fine, Margaret. I'm just having an honest conversation here, man to man. He looked directly at me. Tell me something. If I stood up right now and put my hands on Rebecca, what would you do? Would you actually stop me, or would you just sit there calculating the odds? The entire restaurant section was watching now. Rebecca grabbed my arm, her fingers tight. Garrett, stop it. Right now. I set down my water glass carefully, meeting his eyes. I'd ask you not to do that. Garrett laughed again, that same booming sound. You'd ask. Perfect. That's exactly what I thought. You'd ask nicely, like you're requesting a meeting room. He pushed his chair back and stood up, swaying slightly. You know what your problem is? You're soft. You've probably never been in a real fight in your life. Never had to prove yourself. Just coasted by being non-threatening and hoping nobody notices you're not actually a man. That's when Margaret got on her phone, probably calling security or management. Tom half stood, like he was considering intervening but hadn't committed yet. Vanessa looked horrified. Rebecca was pulling on my arm, whispering, please, let's just go. But Garrett wasn't done. He walked around the table, his bulk casting a shadow as he approached. You know what? Let me show everyone here what I mean. Before I could process what was happening, his hand shot out and grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. Then he shoved, not hard enough to knock me over, but enough to push me backward into the serving cart behind our table. The crash was spectacular. Plates, glasses, silverware, all of it hit the floor in a cascading symphony of breaking china and ringing metal that made everyone in the restaurant turn to stare. The waiter who'd been approaching with our entrees froze, his tray tilted at a dangerous angle. I caught my balance against the wall, my heart hammering. This wasn't embarrassment anymore or awkward social tension. This was assault, witnessed by 50 people in an upscale restaurant. Garrett's face was flushed, whether from bourbon or adrenaline I couldn't tell, and he had this satisfied smirk like he'd just proven his point about me being weak and non-confrontational. What Garrett didn't know, what I'd never mentioned to Rebecca or anyone at her company, was that I'd been training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for 8 years. I started in my mid-20s after getting mugged outside a grocery store, deciding that feeling helpless once was enough for a lifetime. 3 nights a week, sometimes 4, I went to a gym across town and rolled with people who could tie me into knots, learning slowly and painfully how to control another person's body through leverage and technique rather than strength. I had my blue belt after 2 years, purple after 5, and I was closing in on brown. My instructor, a former MMA fighter named Carlos, had drilled one principle into my head above all others. Jiu-Jitsu is not for winning bar fights, it's for surviving actual threats and then getting away safely. I never talked about it because guys like Garrett exist everywhere, and the moment you mention martial arts training they take it as a challenge or an invitation to prove something. I'd learned to just stay quiet and avoid situations where it might become relevant. But Garrett had just crossed a line from verbal harassment into physical assault, and everyone in this restaurant had witnessed it. I straightened up from the serving cart, broken plates crunching under my shoes, and looked at him calmly. That was a mistake, I said quietly. A mistake. Garrett laughed, playing to the crowd. What are you going to do about it, calculator boy? File a report? Write me a strongly worded email? He stepped closer, invading my space deliberately, his chest maybe 6 inches from mine. I could smell the bourbon on his breath. You're not going to do anything because you can't. You're exactly what I said you are, soft, weak, and completely useless when things get physical. Rebecca was on her feet now. Garrett, stop this right now, I'm calling the police. The police, he scoffed. Yeah, let's see how long they take to show up. Meanwhile, your husband gets to stand here and prove he's nothing. That's when he made his second mistake. His right hand came up fast, clearly intending to shove me again or maybe grab my collar, and my training took over before my conscious mind finished processing what was happening. I caught his wrist with my left hand as it came toward me, stepped slightly to the side to get off his center line, and applied a simple gooseneck lock that every white belt learns in their first month. The key to a good wrist lock is angle and leverage, not strength. You rotate the hand past its natural range of motion while controlling the elbow, and suddenly someone twice your size has no choice but to go where the pain isn't. Garrett's confident advance turned into a forward stumble as his wrist bent at an angle it definitely wasn't designed for, and his whole body folded forward to relieve the pressure. His face went from smug superiority to shocked pain in about half a second. Let go, he shouted, trying to pull away, but pulling away from a wrist lock just makes it worse. I guided him down and forward, keeping the pressure consistent, and he went face first into the table we'd been sitting at. His forehead hit the wood with a solid thunk that made Margaret gasp. Water glasses tipped over, soaking the tablecloth. I released his wrist immediately and stepped back, hands up in a non-threatening position. Stay down, I said, my voice still calm. This doesn't need to go any further. But Garrett wasn't thinking clearly anymore. Humiliation and alcohol are a dangerous combination, and he'd just been dumped on his face in front of his entire department by the soft husband he'd been mocking for the past 30 minutes. He pushed himself up from the table, his forehead already showing a red mark that would definitely bruise, and his eyes had that unfocused rage you see in people who've completely stopped thinking rationally. You son of a, he started, and then he charged. Not a smart, controlled movement, just a bull rush with his arms out like he was going to tackle me into the wall. In football that might have worked, but in a restaurant with limited space and furniture everywhere, it was pure stupidity. I had maybe 2 seconds to react. Carlos's voice echoed in my head from hundreds of sparring sessions. When someone bigger rushes you, use their momentum against them, don't try to stop it. I stepped off the line of his charge, grabbed his leading arm with both hands, turned my hips, and executed what's called a sukue nage or scooping throw. Basically, I used his own forward momentum and added a lifting motion under his center of gravity, redirecting all that mass and speed into a direction he wasn't prepared for. Garrett's feet left the ground. For a moment he was horizontal in the air, completely airborne, and then physics took over. He came down hard on his right shoulder and side, hitting the restaurant floor with an impact that I felt through my shoes. The sound was sickening, a meaty thud followed by something that might have been a pop or a crack. Garrett screamed. Not a yell of anger or frustration, but a genuine scream of pain that cut through the shocked silence of the restaurant. He rolled onto his back, clutching his right shoulder, his face contorted and tears streaming down his cheeks. My shoulder, he gasped. Oh God, my shoulder, something's wrong with my shoulder. I stepped back immediately, my hands still up, making sure everyone could see I wasn't approaching him or continuing any aggression. Margaret was already on her phone, practically shouting into it. We need an ambulance at Cascade Steakhouse right now, someone's injured. The restaurant manager appeared from nowhere, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked like he was processing a nightmare scenario for his Yelp reviews. What happened? Someone tell me what happened. At least a dozen people started talking at once. Tom, who'd been sitting at our table, spoke the loudest. Garrett attacked him. He shoved him into the serving cart and then tried to tackle him. This guy was just defending himself. Vanessa nodded frantically. Garrett's been drinking and harassing them all night. He got physical first. Rebecca was kneeling next to me, her hands shaking as she grabbed my arm. Are you okay? Did he hurt you? I'm fine, I said, though my heart was racing and my hands were starting to shake with adrenaline now that the immediate threat was over. I'm completely fine. Garrett was still on the floor, moaning and cradling his arm at a weird angle that suggested his shoulder had dislocated in the fall. His date had finally put down her phone and was standing off to the side, looking at him with an expression that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd humiliated himself in public. The restaurant manager knelt next to Garrett. "Sir, please don't move. The ambulance is on the way." "He attacked me," Garrett groaned through his pain. "That psycho attacked me for no reason." "That's not what happened," Margaret said sharply, her phone still in her hand. "Garrett, you assaulted him first. Everyone here saw it." The manager looked at me. "Sir, I need you to stay here until the police arrive. Don't leave the restaurant." "I'm not going anywhere," I assured him. "I'll give a statement to whoever needs one." The next 10 minutes were chaos. Paramedics arrived first, 2 efficient professionals who assessed Garrett's shoulder and confirmed it was dislocated, possibly with ligament damage. They got him onto a stretcher, still complaining loudly about being attacked, and wheeled him toward the exit. 2 police officers showed up right behind them, an older male cop with gray hair and a younger female officer who immediately started taking control of the scene. "Everyone who witnessed what happened, please stay seated," she announced. "We'll need statements from all of you." The older cop approached me. "You're the one who was involved in the altercation?" "Yes, sir." "My name is—" "Save it for the statement," he interrupted, but not unkindly. "First question, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "No, sir, I'm not hurt at all." He looked me over, noted my complete lack of visible injuries, then glanced toward where the paramedics were loading Garrett into the ambulance. "That gentleman has a dislocated shoulder and possible concussion. Want to tell me how that happened?" Before I could answer, Margaret stepped forward. "Officer, I'm Margaret Chin, head of marketing for Cascade Tech. Garrett works in my department. He's been drinking heavily and spent the last half hour verbally harassing this man and his wife, who's one of my employees. Then he physically assaulted him first by shoving him into that serving cart." She pointed at the wreckage. "Everything escalated from there." The officer wrote that down. "And you saw the whole thing?" "I saw him shove first. What happened after that was fast, but Garrett definitely initiated physical contact." Tom and Vanessa both nodded agreement. The officer looked back at me with new assessment in his eyes. "You have martial arts training?" "Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu," I admitted. 8 years. "That explains the shoulder." "Sukue Nage." I blinked, surprised. "Yes, sir." "You train?" "Used to. Judo for 12 years before my knees gave out." He almost smiled. "Let me guess, he rushed you and you redirected?" "Exactly that." He nodded slowly. "We'll still need your full statement, but between you and me, if a dozen witnesses saw him assault you first, you're probably going to be fine. Textbook self-defense." Rebecca squeezed my hand so hard I thought she might break something. The female officer was moving through the tables, collecting contact information and brief statements from everyone who'd witnessed the incident, and the restaurant manager was hovering nearby like he couldn't decide whether to comp everyone's meals or just pray this didn't end up on social media. Then Margaret pulled Rebecca and me aside, away from the immediate chaos, and her expression was complicated, guilty and angry, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "I need to tell you both something," she said quietly. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, Rebecca. This isn't the first time Garrett's done something like this." Rebecca's face went pale. "What do you mean, not the first time?" Margaret glanced around to make sure we had relative privacy, though the police were still interviewing witnesses at nearby tables. "You filed 3 formal complaints with HR about Garrett over the past 5 months. I know because they copied me on all of them as your department head." I looked at Rebecca, who wouldn't meet my eyes. 3 complaints. 5 months. She'd never mentioned any of this at home. "What kind of complaints?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the growing knot in my stomach. Margaret took a deep breath. "The first one was in January. Garrett had touched Rebecca's lower back during a team meeting, then later made a comment about how she should wear skirts more often because she had nice legs. The second was in March when he sent her text messages at 11 at night asking if she wanted to come over to his place to discuss campaign strategies, with several inappropriate implications about what else they could do. The third was last month when he blocked her in the parking garage after work, stood too close, and told her she was wasting her time with someone who couldn't appreciate what she brought to a relationship. Rebecca was crying now, silent tears running down her face. I put my arm around her shoulders and she leaned into me, her whole body trembling. Why didn't HR do anything? I asked, and I couldn't keep the anger out of my voice anymore. They did, Margaret said defensively. They were building a case. That's how these things work legally. You have to document everything, establish patterns, make sure the evidence is solid before you take action that could result in termination. They gave him written warnings after the first 2 incidents, made him attend harassment training, put notes in his file. But Garrett's smart enough to walk right up to the line without crossing it in ways that would justify immediate termination. He crossed the line tonight, I pointed out. Yes, he did. Spectacularly. Margaret rubbed her temples. But here's what you need to know, and what I'm probably going to get in trouble for telling you. Rebecca isn't the only one. There's another woman in our department, Vanessa, the one who was sitting at our table. She filed a complaint 2 months ago about Garrett cornering her in the supply room and making comments about her body. And there's a junior analyst named Claire who works on the floor below us. She reported that Garrett followed her to her car 3 times after late meetings, always finding excuses to walk the same direction, always making her uncomfortable. I felt Rebecca stiffen against me. I didn't know about Vanessa or Claire, she said quietly. HR keeps complaints confidential unless there's a reason to share them, Margaret explained. But after tonight, after what happened here with all these witnesses, I think the confidentiality concerns are secondary to making sure you understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. The female police officer approached us. Excuse me, Ms. Chin? The detective who's taking lead on this case just arrived. He'd like to speak with you about the workplace history. Margaret nodded and followed her toward a plainclothes detective who'd just walked in, a black man in his 40s wearing a dress shirt and badge on his belt. I watched them talk, saw Margaret gesturing animatedly, saw the detective's expression get progressively more serious. Rebecca pulled away from me slightly, wiping her eyes. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. About the complaints, about how bad it was getting. Why didn't you? I asked, and I tried to keep judgment out of my voice because this clearly wasn't the time, but I needed to understand. Because I knew you'd want to do something. Come to my office, confront him, make a scene. I thought I could handle it through proper channels. I thought if I just documented everything and let HR deal with it, he'd eventually get fired or moved to a different department and that would be the end of it. She looked at me with red eyes. I didn't want you to see me as weak or unable to handle my own professional problems. I would never think that, I said, and I meant it. But 3 complaints, Rebecca. 5 months of this guy harassing you. You must have been miserable. I was, she admitted. Every day going to work wondering if he'd corner me in the break room, or send another creepy text, or make some comment in a meeting that nobody else would catch but I'd know exactly what he meant. And tonight when he started going after you, I just wanted to disappear. I wanted to grab you and leave before it got worse, but then it got worse anyway. The detective approached us, his badge identifying him as Detective Williams. Mr. and Mrs. Harper? I'm going to need detailed statements from both of you, but first I need to show you something that was found on Mr. Garrett's phone. He held up an evidence bag containing a smartphone. When the paramedics were treating him, his phone fell out of his pocket. It was unlocked, and one of my officers noticed the screen showed a video that appeared to be recording. When we examined it more closely, we found something concerning. He pulled out a tablet and brought up a series of screenshots. Mr. Garrett had been recording video of your wife at work without her knowledge or consent. We found over 40 separate clips saved in a hidden folder on his phone. Would you like to see them, or would you prefer I just describe what we found? Rebecca's hand found mine and gripped it desperately. Just describe it, please. Detective Williams nodded. The videos show Mrs. Harper at her desk working in the break room making coffee, walking through the parking lot to her car, and leaving the building at the end of the day. They're all taken from a distance, filmed covertly, and many of them are zoomed in on specific parts of her body. Some have timestamps from as recently as yesterday. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just workplace harassment anymore. This was stalking, obsession, predatory behavior that had been escalating for months while everyone tried to handle it through proper channels. There's more, Detective Williams continued. We also found text conversations between Mr. Garrett and several other men where he shares photos of female coworkers, including your wife, along with explicit commentary about their appearance and speculation about their personal lives. And there are notes in his phone that suggest he's been tracking your wife's schedule, documenting when she arrives at work, when she leaves, what routes she takes through the building. Margaret had rejoined us and was listening with visible horror. I didn't know about any of this. HR never mentioned videos or tracking. That's because HR didn't know, Detective Williams said. This is the kind of behavior that only comes to light during a criminal investigation. Based on what we've found so far, combined with the assault witnessed by multiple people tonight, I'm going to recommend the district attorney file charges for assault, stalking, unlawful surveillance, and criminal threatening. We'll also be executing a search warrant on his apartment and vehicle to see if there's additional evidence. Rebecca was shaking again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was anger. He's been filming me for months. Watching me, following me, and nobody knew. You couldn't have known, I said, though my own mind was reeling. There was no way to know he was doing this. But I knew something was wrong, she insisted. I knew he made me uncomfortable. I knew seeing his car in the parking garage made my stomach hurt. I should have pushed harder, made HR take it more seriously, told you everything so you could help me figure out what to do. Detective Williams cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Harper, I've worked stalking cases for 15 years. Victims always blame themselves for not recognizing the warning signs sooner, but the truth is that predators like Mr. Garrett are skilled at hiding their behavior. They operate in gray areas. They gaslight their victims into doubting their own instincts, and they count on institutional bureaucracy to move slowly enough that they can continue their behavior. None of this is your fault. Vanessa appeared at the edge of our conversation, her face streaked with tears. Rebecca, the detective just told me about the videos. I'm so sorry. If I'd known he was doing that to you, I would have. You filed your own complaint, Rebecca said, reaching out to squeeze Vanessa's hand. You tried to stop him too. We both did everything we were supposed to do. The restaurant had mostly cleared out now, just the police, a few witnesses still giving statements, and our group huddled near the bar. The manager had indeed comped everyone's meals and was probably calculating how much this entire incident was going to cost him in bad publicity. Detective Williams looked at me. Mr. Harper, I'm going to need you to come down to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement about the physical altercation. Bring any medical records if you sustained any injuries, though from what I can see you came through this remarkably unscathed. I'll be there, I assured him, and I'm going to need Mrs. Harper to come in as well to discuss the stalking and harassment complaints in detail. We'll want to build as complete a picture as possible of Mr. Garrett's behavior pattern. He paused. I should tell you that based on the evidence we've already collected, this is going to be a serious case. Mr. Garrett is looking at multiple felony charges, potential prison time, and permanent restraining orders. The company is also likely to face liability questions about why they didn't act more decisively on the complaints they received. The following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the restaurant incident, Detective Williams called to update us on the investigation's progress. Rebecca and I were both sitting in our living room when the call came through on speaker. I wanted you to hear this directly from me before it hits the news, he said, his voice serious. We executed search warrants on Mr. Garrett's apartment and vehicle yesterday. What we found is significantly worse than what was on his phone. Rebecca's hand found mine on the couch. How much worse? We found a laptop in his bedroom with a folder labeled Research that contained detailed files on 5 different women from his workplace, including you. Each file had photographs, some taken from social media and some taken covertly at work or in public places. There were notes about daily routines, relationship statuses, home addresses, family members, and what he termed vulnerability assessments. I felt sick. Vulnerability assessments? His words, not mine. Essentially, he was documenting what he perceived as weaknesses or entry points. For example, your file noted that your husband worked long hours and that you sometimes stayed late at the office alone. It noted that you drove a specific route home that included a stretch of road with minimal traffic. It documented your gym schedule, your favorite coffee shop, and the fact that you'd mentioned in a team meeting that you felt uncomfortable walking to your car alone after dark. Rebecca made a small sound, somewhere between a sob and a gasp. Detective Williams continued, his tone sympathetic but professional. Mrs. Harper, I know this is difficult to hear, but you need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Mr. Garrett wasn't just harassing you impulsively. This was planned, systematic, and escalating. The earliest entries in your file date back 7 months, which means he started documenting you within weeks of joining the company. What about the other women? I asked, trying to focus on actionable information rather than the horror of what Garrett had been doing. Vanessa's file is similar to your wife's. Claire, the junior analyst, has the most extensive documentation because Mr. Garrett identified her as what he called his primary target before shifting focus to Mrs. Harper. There are 2 other women, both from different departments, who didn't file complaints because they didn't realize his attention was anything more than awkward flirting. We're contacting them now to inform them they were being surveilled. Margaret had told us the company was conducting its own internal investigation, separate from the criminal one, and the results were apparently damning. Their IT department had been given access to Garrett's work computer and email, and what they found confirmed that he'd been using company resources to facilitate his stalking. He created a spreadsheet, Margaret told us during a meeting at her office that Wednesday, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. An actual Excel spreadsheet with tabs for different women. It tracked your schedules, logged your interactions with male colleagues, noted what you wore to work, and included a rating system for what he called acquisition difficulty. Rebecca sat across from Margaret's desk, her face pale. A rating system. You were marked as high difficulty because you're married and because you'd rejected his initial attempts at friendly conversation. Claire was marked as medium difficulty because she's single but what he termed professional and risk-averse. Vanessa was low difficulty because she's friendly and he interpreted that as romantic interest. Margaret pushed a printed document across her desk. This is the executive summary of what IT found. I'm showing you this because you have a right to know, but also because the company's legal team is going to contact you about a settlement. They're terrified of the liability exposure here. I scanned the document. The spreadsheet was just the beginning. Garrett had been accessing personnel files he had no legitimate reason to view, pulling home addresses and emergency contact information. He'd been monitoring the building's security camera system to track when specific women arrived and left. He'd even created fake social media accounts to friend request his targets and gain access to their private posts and photos. How did nobody notice this? Rebecca asked, and there was accusation in her voice. How did he access all of this without anyone in IT flagging it as suspicious? Margaret looked genuinely ashamed. Because he had legitimate access to most of these systems as part of his job. Marketing has access to the security camera system for creating promotional materials showing the office environment. He had access to basic personnel information for coordinating team projects. The social media monitoring was done on his personal devices and accounts. He was careful to operate within the boundaries of his authorized access until we had reason to look closer at what he was actually doing with that access. Detective Williams had more to share when we met with him at the police station on Thursday. The search of his vehicle turned up something particularly disturbing, he said, sliding a photograph across the table. This was mounted behind the sun visor in his car. It was a small camera, the kind used for dash cams, but positioned to face outward through the windshield. Mr. Garrett had been parking his vehicle in positions where he could record the building entrance and parking lot. We recovered the SD card and found hundreds of hours of footage showing employees coming and going, with specific focus on the women in his files. He'd apparently been reviewing this footage at home and making notes about patterns. Rebecca was beyond tears now. She'd moved into a cold, focused anger that I recognized from the few times in our marriage when she'd been truly furious. What's being done to make sure he can't continue this from jail? He's currently being held on $100,000 bail, which he hasn't been able to post. The weeks following the investigation were transformative for Rebecca in ways I hadn't expected. I thought she'd be traumatized, withdrawn, maybe even afraid to go back to work. Instead, she became focused and determined in a way I'd never seen before. The first change was how she talked about what happened. Initially, in those first few days after the restaurant incident, she kept apologizing. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I'm sorry I put you in that position. I'm sorry I didn't handle it better." But after meeting with a therapist who specialized in workplace harassment, her language shifted. She stopped saying sorry and started saying what actually happened. Garrett targeted me. Garrett stalked me. Garrett created an unsafe work environment. The blame moved from her shoulders to where it actually belonged. "I kept thinking I must have done something to encourage him," she told me one night while we were making dinner together. "Like maybe I was too friendly in meetings, or I smiled too much when he made jokes, or I didn't shut him down hard enough the first time he made an inappropriate comment. But my therapist pointed out that I did everything right. I documented, I reported, I set boundaries. The system failed, not me." I chopped vegetables while she talked, letting her process without interrupting. "And the thing that makes me angriest," she continued, "is that I made myself smaller because of him. I stopped wearing certain clothes because I didn't want him to comment on them. I changed my route through the office to avoid walking past his desk. I stopped staying late even when I had work to finish because I didn't want to be there when the building was empty. I let him control my behavior without even realizing that's what was happening." "That's what predators do," I said. "They train their victims to accommodate them." "Well, I'm done accommodating." She said it with such conviction that I looked up from the cutting board. "Done accommodating what?" "Anything. Anyone. I'm done making myself smaller to make other people comfortable. I'm done being quiet when someone crosses a line because I don't want to make a scene. I'm done acting like my instincts are overreactions when something feels wrong." This new Rebecca was fiercer, sharper, and honestly a little intimidating. When the company offered her a settlement that included a lateral transfer to manage their new branch office in Salem, 40 minutes north of Portland, she didn't hesitate. "I want it," she told Margaret during the negotiation meeting that I attended as her support. "But I want final say over all hiring decisions for my team. I want a clear reporting structure that doesn't require me to go through Portland HR for internal issues, and I want a 30% salary increase to reflect the expanded responsibilities." Margaret blinked. That's more than we initially discussed." "It's what I'm worth," Rebecca said calmly. "And it's less than what you'll pay in legal fees if I decide the settlement isn't adequate. I have 4 other women who are willing to join a class action lawsuit about the company's negligence in handling Garrett's behavior. I'm offering you a chance to make this right by investing in me and creating an office culture that actually protects employees." She got everything she asked for. The Salem branch opened 6 weeks later with Rebecca at the helm, managing a team of 8 people that she personally vetted and hired. She implemented safety protocols that became the model for the entire company: mandatory harassment training every quarter, not annually, anonymous reporting systems that bypassed immediate supervisors, security cameras in all common areas with footage reviewed weekly by an outside firm, and a zero-tolerance policy that was actually enforced, not just written in a handbook nobody read. But the bigger transformation was in our marriage. We'd always had a good relationship, or so I thought, but the Garrett situation exposed cracks I hadn't noticed. Rebecca had been keeping major stressors from me for months, and I'd been too passive to push when I sensed something was wrong. "Why didn't you tell me how bad it was?" I asked her one Sunday morning over coffee, weeks after everything had settled into a new normal. "Why did you think you had to handle it alone?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Because I was afraid you'd overreact. That you'd show up at my office and confront him, or call the police before I had enough documentation, or do something that would make me look like I couldn't handle my own professional problems. I've spent my entire career proving I'm competent and strong, and admitting that some guy was harassing me felt like admitting weakness." "That's not weakness," I said. "That's being targeted by a predator." "I know that now. But in the moment, when it's happening to you, It's hard to see it clearly. You start questioning yourself. Maybe he's just socially awkward. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Maybe if I just ignore it, he'll get bored and move on. You tell yourself these stories because accepting the truth means accepting that you're in danger, and that's terrifying. I reached across the table and took her hand. I'm sorry I didn't push harder when I noticed you were stressed. I should have asked more questions, made it clear that you could tell me anything without judgment. And I'm sorry I didn't trust you enough to tell you. I kept thinking I was protecting you from worry, but really I was just protecting my own pride. She squeezed my fingers. We need to be better at this. At actually communicating instead of trying to manage everything independently. We started doing things differently after that. Rebecca began telling me when something at work bothered her, even small things, and I started asking specific questions instead of accepting work was fine as a complete answer. When she mentioned feeling uncomfortable about a new client who'd commented on her appearance, I didn't dismiss it as harmless or tell her she was overreacting. I listened, asked what she needed from me, and supported her decision to have a male colleague attend all future meetings with that client. She stopped trying to handle everything alone, and I stopped assuming that silence meant everything was okay. The change in Rebecca's professional life was remarkable to watch. At the Salem branch, she was confident in ways she'd never been in Portland. She spoke up in meetings without softening her opinions with qualifiers like, I might be wrong but, or, this is just my thought. She set clear boundaries with clients and colleagues, saying no to unreasonable requests without lengthy explanations or apologies. She fired a contractor within his first month when she discovered he'd made inappropriate comments to one of her female employees, and she did it without second-guessing herself or worrying about whether she was being too harsh. The old me would have given him a warning, she told me after that incident. Would have worried about being fair, about giving him a second chance, about whether I was overreacting. The new me understands that protecting my team is more important than protecting someone's feelings about facing consequences for their behavior. 6 months after taking over the Salem branch, Rebecca's team had the highest productivity metrics and the lowest turnover rate in the entire company. Other managers started asking her for advice, and she began conducting training sessions about creating safe, effective workplace cultures. She wasn't just recovering from what Garrett had done, she was using it as fuel to become better, stronger, more effective. Do you ever regret how everything happened? I asked her one evening as we walked through our neighborhood. I mean, obviously I wish Garrett had never targeted you in the first place, but do you regret the restaurant incident? The public confrontation? She thought about it. No. Because if it hadn't happened publicly, with witnesses and police and all that evidence collected immediately, he might have kept escalating. He might have hurt me, or Vanessa, or Claire, or one of the other women he was tracking. The restaurant incident stopped him before he could do worse. And it forced me to confront things I'd been avoiding about workplace culture, about my own boundaries, about our marriage. It was horrible, but it needed to happen. I understood what she meant. Sometimes the worst moments force growth that comfortable times never could. The preliminary hearing happened 4 months after the restaurant incident, on a gray Tuesday morning in October. Rebecca and I arrived at the courthouse early, meeting Lisa Chen and Detective Williams in the hallway outside the courtroom. Garrett was already there with his defense attorney, a sharp-looking man in an expensive suit named Robert Duvall who had a reputation for getting charges reduced in harassment cases. Just to prepare you, Lisa said quietly, Duvall is going to try to paint your husband as the aggressor and Garrett as the victim of excessive force. He'll argue that the injuries Garrett sustained were disproportionate to the threat he posed, and he'll try to get the assault charges against Garrett dropped while potentially opening your husband up to civil liability. I'd been expecting this. My own attorney, a former prosecutor named Patricia Gomez, had warned me that self-defense cases could get complicated when the person defending themselves had martial arts training and the aggressor ended up seriously injured. They'll try to make you sound like a trained fighter who used excessive force against an untrained drunk guy, Patricia had explained. We counter that by emphasizing that Garrett initiated physical contact, that you used minimal necessary force to stop an ongoing threat, and that his injuries resulted from his own aggressive actions, not from you attacking him. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with maybe 30 seats for observers. Vanessa and Claire were both there, along with Margaret and several other people from Rebecca's company. Garrett's mother sat in the front row on the defense side, glaring at us with obvious hatred. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Anderson, called the court to order and Garrett was brought in from a side door. He looked thinner than I remembered, his right arm still in a sling from the shoulder dislocation. His eyes found Rebecca immediately, and even from across the courtroom I could see the intensity of his stare. She didn't look away. Just met his gaze steadily until he was the one who broke eye contact. Duvall stood to present his opening argument. Your Honor, this case has been grossly mischaracterized as a clear-cut situation of workplace harassment and self-defense. In reality, what we have is a tragic misunderstanding that escalated due to alcohol consumption and the excessive, disproportionate violence of a trained martial artist against an untrained civilian. He gestured toward me. Mr. Harper has 8 years of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training. He holds a purple belt, which represents advanced technical skill. When my client, who had consumed alcohol and made some admittedly inappropriate comments, made physical contact with Mr. Harper, the response was not to de-escalate or retreat. Instead, Mr. Harper used his training to inflict serious injuries, a dislocated shoulder requiring surgical repair, a concussion, and psychological trauma that has left my client unable to work. Lisa stood. Your Honor, the defense is attempting to create a narrative that ignores the documented evidence of Mr. Garrett's systematic stalking and harassment of multiple women, including Mrs. Harper. This wasn't a tragic misunderstanding. This was the culmination of a 7-month campaign of predatory behavior. Judge Anderson raised her hand. I've reviewed the evidence submitted by both sides. Ms. Chin, I'm prepared to hear your presentation of that evidence now. What followed was 2 hours of methodical documentation. Lisa presented the videos found on Garrett's phone, playing several clips that showed Rebecca at her desk, completely unaware she was being filmed. She presented the spreadsheet, projecting it onto a screen so everyone in the courtroom could see the tabs labeled with women's names and the tracking data beneath each one. She presented the photographs found in Garrett's apartment, hundreds of images of Rebecca taken over months without her knowledge or consent. This is not normal romantic interest, Lisa said, her voice carrying authority. This is obsessive surveillance with predatory intent. Mr. Garrett documented his target's vulnerabilities, tracked their movements, and created detailed plans for gaining access to them. The restaurant incident was not an isolated event caused by alcohol and poor judgment. It was an escalation of behavior that had been building for months and that would have continued to escalate had it not been publicly exposed. Duvall tried to counter. The prosecution is conflating separate issues. Yes, my client showed poor judgment in how he expressed his interest in Mrs. Harper. Yes, he should have been more respectful of workplace boundaries. But none of that justifies the level of violence Mr. Harper used in response to what was, at most, a drunken shove. A drunken shove? Lisa's voice rose slightly. Your client assaulted Mr. Harper in front of 50 witnesses, and when Mr. Harper defended himself using minimal necessary force, your client charged him in a clear attempt to inflict further violence. Mr. Harper used techniques specifically designed to control and neutralize a threat without causing permanent injury. The fact that your client was injured is a direct result of his own aggressive actions. Judge Anderson interrupted. Mr. Duvall, I'm curious about your strategy here. You're asking me to dismiss the assault charges against your client while simultaneously arguing that Mr. Harper used excessive force. You can't have it both ways. Either your client's actions constituted assault, which justifies self-defense, or they didn't, which means we dismiss everything and everyone goes home. Which is it? Duvall hesitated, clearly caught in the logical trap. Your Honor, we believe the appropriate outcome is to recognize that both parties bear some responsibility for what happened. That's not how the law works, Judge Anderson said dryly. Ms. Chin, do you have additional evidence to present? Yes, Your Honor. We have testimony from the victims of Mr. Garrett's harassment, and we have a surprise witness who contacted our office last week with information about Mr. Garrett's prior behavior at previous employers. That got everyone's attention. Duvall stood quickly. Your Honor, we weren't informed of any additional witnesses. Because she only came forward 6 days ago, Lisa said. And given the relevance of her testimony to establishing a pattern of behavior, we believe the court should hear it. Judge Anderson considered. I'll allow it. Call your witness. The courtroom door opened and a woman in her 40s walked in, professional attire, confident bearing. She was sworn in and took the witness stand, stating her name as Jennifer Garrett. Garrett's face went white. His attorney leaned over to whisper urgently to him, but Garrett just sat there staring at the woman with obvious shock and something that looked like fear. Ms. Garrett, what is your relationship to the defendant? Lisa asked. I'm his ex-wife. We were married for 4 years and divorced 3 years ago. And why did you decide to come forward now? Jennifer's jaw tightened. Because I saw the news coverage of this case and I recognized the pattern. Everything I'm hearing about what he did to these women, the stalking, the surveillance, the obsessive tracking, it's exactly what he did to me during our marriage and after our divorce. Lisa walked her through it methodically. Garrett had installed tracking software on Jennifer's phone without her knowledge. He'd created fake social media profiles to monitor her online activity after she blocked his real accounts. He'd shown up at her workplace repeatedly, claiming he just wanted to talk, until her employer had to involve security. He'd been fired from 2 previous jobs for inappropriate behavior toward female colleagues, something his employment history had conveniently omitted. I obtained a restraining order against him 3 years ago, Jennifer said, her voice steady. He violated it twice before the court threatened him with jail time. After that, he stopped direct contact, but I know he was still monitoring me through other means because he'd make comments when we had to communicate about finalizing financial matters, comments that showed he knew things about my life he shouldn't have known. Duvall tried to object. Your Honor, this is character assassination. My client's past relationship difficulties have no bearing on the current charges. On the contrary, Lisa said, this establishes a clear pattern of predatory behavior spanning multiple years and multiple victims. Mr. Garrett didn't suddenly develop these behaviors. He's been refining them, learning from his mistakes, getting better at hiding his activities. The only reason he was caught this time is because he lost control in a public setting with witnesses. Judge Anderson was taking notes, her expression unreadable. When Jennifer finished her testimony, she looked directly at Garrett. I hope they send you to prison. Not because I hate you, but because you need to be somewhere where you can't hurt anyone else. You're sick, and you refuse to get help, and eventually you were going to escalate beyond stalking. I'm just grateful it happened in a restaurant with witnesses instead of in some woman's home where nobody could have stopped you. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Garrett's mother was crying. His attorney looked like he was calculating how badly this testimony had destroyed any chance of getting the charges reduced. Lisa called Rebecca to the stand next, and she walked up with her head high, no hesitation. She described the months of harassment, the complaints to HR that went nowhere, the constant fear she'd felt walking to her car, the way Garrett had made her feel unsafe in her own workplace. Did you ever encourage Mr. Garrett's attention? Lisa asked. No. I was polite and professional because he was a colleague, but I never gave him any indication that I was interested in anything beyond a working relationship. When he started making inappropriate comments, I told him directly to stop. When he continued, I filed formal complaints. I did everything I was supposed to do, and it didn't stop him. Duvall declined to cross-examine, probably recognizing that attacking Rebecca on the stand would only make his client look worse. The hearing wrapped up with testimony from Detective Williams about the evidence collected and from the police officer who'd witnessed the restaurant incident. When everything was finished, Judge Anderson reviewed her notes for a long moment before speaking. I've heard enough. Mr. Duvall, your motion to dismiss the charges against your client is denied. In fact, given the evidence presented today, I'm denying bail. Mr. Garrett will remain in custody pending trial. Garrett stood up angrily. This is insane. I didn't do anything that justifies. Sit down, Mr. Garrett, Judge Anderson said sharply. You stalked multiple women, surveilled them without consent, assaulted someone in a public place, and demonstrated a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years. You're a danger to the community and a flight risk. Bail is denied. The bailiff moved to escort Garrett out, and he looked back at Rebecca one more time. Whatever he saw in her face made him look away quickly. 3 months later, the trial resulted in a guilty verdict on all counts. Garrett received a sentence of 2 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation, mandatory counseling, and permanent restraining orders prohibiting any contact with Rebecca, Vanessa, Claire, or any of the other women he'd targeted. He was also required to register as a sex offender due to the unlawful surveillance convictions. 18 months after the restaurant incident, Rebecca and I were having dinner at a new place near her Salem office when she mentioned something that caught me off guard. "I got a call from a reporter today," she said, twirling pasta on her fork. "She's writing an article about workplace harassment and wanted to interview me about the Garrett case. Apparently, it's becoming a landmark example in legal circles." I set down my water glass. "Are you going to do it?" "I already did. Spent 2 hours on the phone with her this afternoon." She smiled at my surprised expression. The old Rebecca would have said no, would have worried about privacy or professional reputation or drawing more attention to something traumatic. The new Rebecca understands that sharing my story might help other women recognize the warning signs before their situation escalates the way mine did. The article ran 3 weeks later in a major Portland newspaper, and it was comprehensive. It detailed not just what happened to Rebecca, but how the company's inadequate response to her complaints had enabled Garrett's behavior to escalate. It included interviews with Vanessa and Claire, with Margaret about the changes they'd implemented afterward, and with Lisa Chun about the legal implications. The impact was immediate and unexpected. Rebecca started getting emails from women at other companies, thanking her for speaking up, sharing their own stories of workplace harassment that they'd never reported because they didn't think anyone would take them seriously. HR departments across Portland began reaching out to Rebecca's company, asking for copies of their revised harassment policies and training materials. The Salem branch became a case study in how to create genuinely safe workplace culture, and Rebecca was invited to speak at conferences about her experience. "I never wanted to be the face of workplace harassment advocacy," she told me after her 3rd speaking engagement. "But if my nightmare can prevent someone else's, then maybe it wasn't completely pointless." The changes at her company went beyond just policy updates. They hired an outside firm to conduct annual culture audits, surveying employees anonymously about whether they felt safe reporting concerns. They implemented a system where harassment complaints were reviewed by a committee that included both management and employee representatives, preventing situations where a single supervisor could bury concerning reports. They created a rapid response protocol that required immediate action when complaints involved potential safety threats, not the slow documentation process that had allowed Garrett to operate freely for months. Other companies started adopting similar measures, particularly after Rebecca's company settled with the victims for an undisclosed amount that industry insiders estimated was substantial enough to get every HR department in the region paying attention to their liability exposure. Margaret told us the settlement was large enough that the company's insurance rates had increased significantly, which provided financial incentive for them to actually enforce their new policies rather than just having them on paper. I'd made changes in my own life too. The restaurant incident had reminded me that the jiu-jitsu training I'd been doing for years wasn't just about sport or fitness. It was about being prepared to protect myself and the people I cared about when situations escalated beyond verbal de-escalation. But it also made me think about all the people who didn't have that training, who froze when confronted with physical aggression because they'd never learned how to respond effectively. 6 months after the trial ended, I approached Carlos at the gym with an idea. "What do you think about offering self-defense seminars specifically designed for workplace professionals? Not full martial arts training, just practical techniques for recognizing threats and responding effectively in corporate environments." Carlos, who'd been teaching jiu-jitsu for 20 years and had strong opinions about most things, considered it. "Most self-defense seminars are garbage. They teach people techniques that don't work under pressure and give them false confidence. But if we did it right, focused on awareness, de-escalation, and only physical techniques that actually function when you're scared and your fine motor skills disappear, it could be valuable." We developed a 4-hour workshop that covered recognizing predatory behavior patterns, setting firm boundaries, using environmental awareness to avoid dangerous situations, and basic physical techniques for escaping common attacks. The physical component was minimal because we both understood that 4 hours of training doesn't make someone a fighter, but it can teach them enough to create an opportunity to escape, which is the actual goal in real self-defense situations. Rebecca helped me market the workshops to Portland area companies, and the response was overwhelming. We filled the first session within 3 days of announcing it, mostly women but some men too, all of them looking for practical tools to handle situations their regular lives hadn't prepared them for. "This is what I needed a year ago," one participant told me after the first workshop. "Not just the physical techniques, but understanding that the uncomfortable feeling I get when someone violates my boundaries is valid. That I don't have to be polite to someone who's making me feel unsafe." We ran the workshops quarterly, and eventually other gyms in the area started offering similar programs. Carlos was pleased that we'd started something that was spreading beyond our own gym, and I was satisfied that the worst night of our lives had led to something constructive that might prevent similar situations for other people. Rebecca maintained close relationships with Vanessa and Claire. They met for lunch monthly, a support group of 3 women who'd survived the same predator and came out stronger. Vanessa had transferred to a different company and was thriving in a new role. Claire had gone back to school for her MBA and was positioning herself for management positions where she'd have the authority to create the kind of safe environments she wished she'd had. "We call ourselves the Garrett Survivors Club," Rebecca joked once, though there was steel underneath the humor. "We're the women who refuse to let one sick man define our careers or make us afraid of our own workplaces." The 3 of them had also become advocates, consulting with companies about harassment policies, speaking at university career centers about recognizing and reporting workplace abuse, and supporting other women who were dealing with similar situations. They'd turned their trauma into purpose, which seemed like the best kind of revenge. Our marriage was stronger than it had ever been, built on the foundation of honest communication we'd established in the aftermath of everything. Rebecca no longer tried to handle major stressors alone, and I no longer assumed that silence meant contentment. We checked in with each other regularly, actually listened to the answers, and made decisions together instead of trying to independently manage our separate spheres. We celebrated our 8th wedding anniversary with a weekend trip to the coast, just the 2 of us without work or stress or any of the complicated history that had defined the past 18 months. Standing on the beach watching the sunset, Rebecca leaned against me. "I was thinking about that night at the restaurant," she said. "About how terrified I was when Garrett started going after you, how certain I was that everything was going to fall apart." "It kind of did fall apart," I pointed out. "Yeah, but then we put it back together better than it was before. Stronger. More honest. More us." She turned to look at me. "I never thanked you properly for what you did that night. For defending me, for defending yourself, for not backing down when he tried to make you feel small. You don't need to thank me for that. You're my wife. Of course I was going to protect you. I know. But I want you to understand that it wasn't just the physical protection that mattered. It was seeing you stand up for us, for our relationship, for the principle that nobody gets to treat people that way without consequences. You showed me what real strength looks like, and it's not about being loud or aggressive or dominating everyone around you. It's about being calm and capable and doing what needs to be done when everything goes wrong." I kissed the top of her head. "You showed me what real strength looks like too. Watching you transform from someone who was afraid and second-guessing herself into someone who runs an entire office, advocates for other victims, and speaks at conferences about workplace safety, that's the most impressive thing I've ever witnessed." The Garrett case became something of a legend in Portland's legal and business communities. Law firms used it in training about harassment litigation. HR departments referenced it when updating their policies. And occasionally, we'd hear through the grapevine about some other company taking swift action on a harassment complaint, with someone mentioning, "We're not going to have another Garrett situation here." Garrett himself was released from prison after serving 18 months of his 2-year sentence, and according to the terms of his probation, he moved to a different state where he was required to register as a sex offender and attend mandatory counseling. The restraining orders remained in effect, and we received notification that any violation would result in immediate arrest and additional prison time. We never heard from him again. Rebecca occasionally checked his social media, just to make sure he wasn't trying to circumvent the restraining order or contact any of his previous victims, but his accounts remained inactive. "I hope he actually gets help," she said once after one of these checks. "Not for his sake, but for whoever might cross his path in the future. I hope the counseling and consequences actually change something." I wasn't as optimistic, having seen how often people with his behavior patterns refuse to acknowledge their actions or take responsibility for the harm they caused. But I hoped she was right. The lasting impact of everything wasn't just about Garrett facing consequences or our marriage getting stronger or Rebecca's career flourishing. It was about the dozens of women who attended our self-defense workshops and learned they didn't have to accept threatening behavior. It was about the companies that updated their policies and actually enforced them because they'd seen the legal and financial consequences of failing to protect employees. It was about Vanessa and Claire and the other women who'd been targeted finding their voices and refusing to be silenced by shame or fear. It was about creating ripples that spread outward from one terrible night, changing workplace cultures and personal relationships and the way people thought about harassment and safety and consequences. 2 years after the restaurant incident, Rebecca's Salem branch was featured in a business magazine as one of the most innovative and successful offices in the region. The article highlighted not just their productivity metrics, but their retention rates and employee satisfaction scores, which were significantly higher than industry averages. "Employees perform better when they feel safe," Rebecca was quoted as saying in the article. "That seems obvious, but too many companies treat safety as a checkbox item rather than a fundamental requirement. We built our culture on the principle that everyone deserves to come to work without fear, and everything else follows from that foundation." She turned her worst experience into her greatest professional achievement, and I was proud of her in ways I couldn't adequately express. The data analyst in me appreciated the metrics, the hard numbers that proved her approach worked. The husband in me just loved seeing her happy and confident and thriving in an environment she'd created. Sometimes people ask me if I regret what happened that night, if I wish I'd handled things differently. The truth is complicated. I regret that Rebecca had to go through months of harassment and fear. I regret that other women were victimized before anyone stopped Garrett. I regret that it took a public confrontation with witnesses and police involvement before the system finally responded appropriately. But I don't regret defending us when Garrett made it physical. I don't regret the marriage we built in the aftermath. I don't regret the workshops that might prevent someone else from experiencing what we did. And I don't regret that Garrett finally faced real consequences for behavior he'd apparently been getting away with for years. The worst night of our lives became a turning point that changed everything for the better, and if I had to go through it again knowing what I know now about where we'd end up, I'd make the same choices. That's the thing about crisis moments. They reveal who you really are and what you're capable of becoming. Rebecca discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. I learned that protecting the people you love sometimes means not backing down even when every instinct says to de-escalate and avoid conflict. Together, we learned that the strongest relationships aren't the ones that never face challenges, but the ones that face challenges head-on and come out transformed on the other side.